In the year 1847, the Blue Ridge Mountains stood cloaked in hunger and shadow, their valleys echoing with the cries of families scraping against starvation. Winter had struck with a cruelty that bit into the bones of the enslaved who lived beneath the Harwick household. The Harwicks owned vast acres of rocky soil that yielded little, and their cruelty made survival more torment than life. In the Harwick home, Eleanor the matriarch ruled with an iron will and sharp tongue. She recorded every ounce of grain, every cut of meat, and every loaf of bread. Her ledger was not a book of accounts, but a ledger of power, deciding who ate and who starved. Her obsession with control reduced her household into a place of fear where even her children, Marcus, David, and James, dared not challenge her. The enslaved people beneath them bore the greatest suffering. They labored from dawn to nightfall, under whip and threat, with little to sustain them. Samuel, strong in body, and sharper still in mind, worked the fields with the others. He was joined by Joshua Thomas Ruth and young Moses. Their days blurred together with hunger, scratching at their ribs, and the mountain wind howling through gaps in their cabins. That winter, Eleanor's cruelty grew more pointed. She locked away provisions from the slaves, hoarding barrels of salted pork and cornmeal, as if the cold itself might steal them. Her demands for perfection in smokehouse and distillery work became unbearable. Each mistake brought punishment, and Samuel knew that mistakes would come, for starving hands could not hold steady forever. It was Ruth who began whispering that they would not survive another winter if they waited for Eleanor's mercy. She reminded them that the mountain was hungrier than all of them combined, and that survival would demand a reckoning. Thomas spoke of smoke and salt, of how the Harwicks lived fat while they wasted away. Joshua spoke of freedom, the kind that was taken, not given. Moses, too young to understand, spoke of fire, always of fire, that warmed him in his sleep. Samuel carried their words like coals smoldering in his chest. He knew they were right. The ledger Eleanor kept was a ledger of death, and the only way to balance it was to write in blood. The mountain would be fed, and it would not be the slaves who filled its hunger. The plan did not form in haste, but in long nights whispered by the fire. Samuel listened to the wind beating against the cabin walls, and heard in it the voice of the mountain demanding payment. He and Ruth sat close, so their words would not carry beyond their walls. She spoke of poison, the way Eleanor sprinkled it upon others in her cruelty, not as death, but as control. Ruth knew herbs and roots, bitter leaves that could still a heart or twist the belly until the strongest man crumpled. Samuel nodded. For the first time he allowed himself to imagine the Harwicks gone. Joshua's mind was drawn to preservation. He studied the smokehouse more carefully each day, watching the way Thomas managed heat and smoke for Eleanor. He began measuring in his head how long flesh could be cured, how salt could draw moisture until the meat kept through winter. He did not speak these thoughts aloud, but Samuel saw the gleam in his eye. Survival was no longer about corn or pork, but about something darker. Even young Moses sensed what was coming. The boy played with fire as if it were his companion. He spoke of burning the big house of smoke rising over the valley. But Samuel knew fire would bring outsiders. They needed silence. They needed secrecy. The mountain did not want spectacle. It wanted hunger, satisfied in the quiet. The turning point came one evening when Eleanor struck Ruth across the face for seasoning, a broth too heavily with pepper. Ruth stood still, her cheek aflame, her eyes filled not with tears, but with cold decision. Samuel saw it, he felt it too. The moment passed, but the choice had been made. It was no longer survival of hunger, but survival of justice, twisted by cruelty into something sharper than revenge. The Harwicks believed they owned bodies and futures. Samuel and his people would show them that ownership meant nothing. When the mountain itself claimed you, the night they chose was moonless and heavy with mist. The valley lay in silence, broken only by the hoot of an owl. The Harwick household gathered for supper, unaware that the very table they sat at would become their undoing. Ruth moved among them quietly, serving with hands steady as stone. The broth steamed in bowls. The roasted meat glistened. The bread was soft and golden. Eleanor praised her own recipe, not knowing that Ruth had altered it with care. Samuel sat in the corner, head bowed as if obedient, but inside his mind he counted each breath, waiting for the moment when the poison would begin to work. It began with a cough. Marcus clutched his chest, his spoon clattering against the wood. Eleanor scolded him, thinking him drunk until her own throat tightened. David gasped, trying to rise, but his legs refused to obey. One by one, the family bent forward, collapsing against the table, their silverware striking the plates like the tolling of a bell. The great house fell silent, except for the ragged sound of dying breaths. Samuel gave no signal yet. Every soul in the cabin knew their part. Joshua barred the doors. Moses tended the fires. Ruth stood over Eleanor, watching as the mistress's proud face twisted in confusion. Then terror. Samuel knelt by the eldest Harwick, leaning close enough that his words were carried into the man's last fading breath. "You called us less than men," he whispered. "Tonight the mountain proves you wrong." Outside, the dogs howled, sensing the change that had fallen upon the valley. The night grew heavier, pressing against the windows, as though the very earth itself was listening to what had been done. In that silence, broken only by shallow dying gasps, Samuel's group crossed a line no one could ever return from. Revenge was not a sudden fire, but a slow, cold transformation. In that moment, the chains that had bound them dissolved not by law or mercy, but by the weight of choice. They had taken the Harwick's power into their own hands, and the mountain accepted the offering. When dawn came, it did not bring peace. The sun rose pale and distant over the ridges, casting long shadows across the Harwick property. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, but inside the house silence reigned. The bodies of the Harwick family lay slumped where they had fallen. Their wealth and arrogance dissolved in a single night. Samuel stood over them, not with triumph, but with a grim awareness of what survival demanded. This was no simple act of vengeance. This was the birth of something far more unsettling. The group moved quickly for the valley, would not wait, and suspicion could arrive with the next traveler. Joshua dragged the bodies to the cellar, his muscles straining against the weight. Marcus and David, the surviving sons, were spared for now, bound and gagged in the corner. Their terror was useful, their knowledge of roots and trade invaluable. The rest of the family, however, had been claimed by the mountain. Ruth lit the lantern in the smokehouse, her face lit with the steady glow of flame. She did not tremble. Her hands moved as if guided by memory. The same techniques Eleanor had once used, now turned against her own kin. The carcasses were hung. The fire's stoked salt rubbed into flesh with clinical precision. It was not cruelty that guided Ruth. It was the cold necessity of winter. Samuel spoke little, but his presence filled the room. He understood what this meant. The valley would feed, but it would demand more than labor. It would demand that they cross boundaries carved deep into human belief. Each body stripped of identity became something else. Not master, not owner, but sustenance. The line between justice and horror blurred until it vanished altogether. The youngest Moses asked no questions. He tended the fire, watching the smoke curl upward, carrying secrets into the gray sky. Children learn quickly when survival is at stake. He saw no masters, only food, no oppressors, only the end of hunger. His eyes reflected not innocence lost, but a new world born in blood and smoke. That night, as they ate in silence, Samuel whispered to the others, "This is not about revenge alone. This is about the future. We are no longer slaves. We are the keepers of the mountain's law, and the mountain has accepted our offering." The days that followed moved with an eerie rhythm. The valley that had once echoed with the commands of the Harwick masters now pulsed with new order. Samuel's group established a system, every motion deliberate, every task measured against the weight of survival. Joshua controlled the smokehouse, maintaining fires at perfect heat, the air thick with the pungent sweetness of hickory. Ruth recorded each step in Eleanor's old ledger, turning the mistress's proud recipes into grim instructions for a new life. The transformation of the Harwick estate was swift. The grand parlor, once filled with silver and fine china, became a workshop of survival. The plantation kitchen no longer served feasts for white masters, but became the heart of an enterprise born from necessity. The cellars filled with preserved flesh lined neatly in rows, salted and hung as though they were nothing more than deer or hog. The work was meticulous, clinical, devoid of ritual, yet it carried the gravity of something greater than survival. Marcus and David still lived though bound and watched. They whispered prayers when they thought no one listened, begging for release from mercy. But Samuel knew mercy was a chain, and chains had no place in this new world. Their lives had value, not for what they were, but for what they knew. Knowledge of trade buyers and routes was power more useful than their bodies. Samuel had learned that true mastery was not in killing quickly, but in extracting everything before the mountain took its due. At night the fires painted shadows against the cabin walls. The children lay awake listening to the creak of wood and the faint hiss of smoke. Sarah whispered to Moses, asking if God would punish them. Moses did not answer. He only stared into the dark with eyes too old for his years. He had seen the flesh of masters hung beside hogs. He had smelled the smoke that erased all difference between man and beast. In Tiu, had silence a truth hardened within him. Punishment was no longer God's domain. It was theirs. Outside the valley held its breath. The birds grew quiet, as if the land itself understood what had been unleashed. The Harwick name had dissolved into smoke and salt, and the mountain accepted its new children, not as slaves, but as keepers of an ancient law, older than scripture, older than empire. A law that whispered, survival has no boundaries. The winter deepened, and with it the silence of the mountains. Snow fell heavy on the ridges, burying paths and sealing the valley from the outside world. The Harwick estate stood like an island cut off from time's smoke rising in steady columns, a false sign of domestic peace. To travelers passing distantly, it appeared the family thrived through the cold months. In truth, the house had become a chamber of transformation, where power was being reforged in the most forbidden way. Samuel kept watch over every detail, his mind no longer chained to orders, but sharpened by the need to outthink hunger and suspicion. He saw clearly that this was not a single act of vengeance. It was a system, a structure, one that mirrored the very hierarchy that had once crushed them, but now reversed. Ruth handled the smokehouse with precision. Each cut salted, each strip hung as though they were following sacred instructions. The line between survival and ritual blurred until they no longer knew which guided their hands. Joshua patrolled the grounds. He had once been beaten for pausing too long by the river. Now he walked with authority. His every step, a claim upon land that had once rejected him. Even the dogs obeyed him, their loyalty transferred without question. The estate no longer belonged to the Harwicks. It had been claimed by those who had bled for it. Yet not all was silence. Marcus and David, their mouths bound with ragged cloths, watched every motion with hollow eyes. They understood too late the weight of cruelty turned inward. Samuel did not gloat. He did not mock. Instead, he leaned close and whispered words that chilled more deeply than winter. This is what you built. You thought chains could hold forever, but chains rust and hunger does not. At night, when the wind roared through the hollows, the group gathered by the fire. Their faces glowed in the flickering light. They spoke little, for words were fragile and suck each moments. Instead, they ate in silence. Each bite, a reminder of the line they had crossed. Each swallow pulled them further from the world of law and scripture, deeper into the mountain's truth. Freedom was no longer an idea whispered in shadows. It was flesh. It was fire. It was the refusal to starve while masters feasted. The valley itself seemed to bend to their will. The snow protected them, hiding all traces of what had been done. The mountain kept their secret, and in return demanded only one thing: that they continue. The valley grew hungrier as the season dragged on. The cold gnawed at bone and marrow, but within the Harwick estate, the fires never dimmed. Smoke poured steady from the chimneys like the breath of some hidden beast, whispering to the mountains that life still endured. Samuel moved among his people with a stern calm, guiding each task with the authority of one who understood that hesitation meant death. Ruth measured salt with the patience of a scholar, recording her notes in a trembling script that turned survival into science. Joshua oversaw the distillery perfecting mash and flame, as though he had been born to it. The transformation unsettled even those who carried it out. What began as survival now carried the weight of permanence. Each day they woke to find themselves not merely free, but something else altogether. Bound not by chains, but by choices that reshaped their very nature. Marcus and David watched from their corner, their bodies weak, but their eyes wide with horror. They were being used not simply as prisoners, but as reservoirs of knowledge. Samuel forced them to speak names of traitors' routes and debts. Each word dragged from their mouths was another nail in the coffin of the Harwick legacy. Children should have been spared such weight, but Moses and Sarah bore it like second skin. Moses stoked fires that cooked the flesh. Sarah stirred pots, seasoned with herbs, Ruth taught her. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She only learned. Their innocence was stripped away, replaced with a cold clarity that life would never again belong to the old order. The laughter of children was gone, replaced by the quiet industry of survival. At night, when the snow howled outside, Samuel gathered them close, his voice deep and commanding. He reminded them that they were not criminals, but survivors, not monsters, but the chosen heirs of the mountain's law. He spoke of freedom not as a dream, but as a brutal truth carved from blood and smoke. His words bound them together in ways stronger than any chain. He told them that what had been taken from them could never be restored, but what they built now would belong to them alone. And as the fire crackled against the dark, the group sat in silence, each face lit with flickering light. Each heart carried the same knowledge. They were no longer waiting for freedom. They had already taken it, and the mountain had marked them forever. Whispers began to crawl down from the ridge into nearby settlements. Strange stories carried by trappers and hunters who had strayed too close to the valley. Some swore they saw smoke rising at odd hours, a pale gray, that carried the scent of charred meat that no beast of the mountain could explain. Others spoke of eerie silence around the Harwick estate, as if the land itself held its breath in dread. The house that once rang with laughter of masters and wails of servants now pulsed with a darker rhythm that unsettled even the most hardened frontiersmen. Merchants noticed debts unpaid, roots abandoned, livestock missing, when pressed locals muttered only half-formed theories. Some said the family had vanished overnight. Others whispered of a fever that left the estate cursed, but no one dared go close. Fear coated their tongues with silence, for they sensed that something unnatural lingered within the valley. The Harwick name, which once inspired greed and respect, now reeked of suspicion and dread. Samuel knew the danger well. He cautioned the others to stay hidden, to guard their firelight with precision, to let no careless sign betray them. Ruth scrubbed bones clean before burying them deep. Joshua tested smoke channels that carried scent away on the wind. Every act was calculated like a military campaign, for they understood discovery would not bring pity, but fire and rope. Marcus and David, however, saw opportunity, their weakened bodies still chained in corners, yet their minds plotted escape. They whispered when they thought none could hear, praying that rumors would bring riders armed with vengeance. They believed salvation would come not from God, but from the men who once called them masters. They imagined the valley stormed with torches, Samuel hanging from a tree, Ruth burned alive, Moses dragged screaming. They fed on visions of revenge, even as their strength drained day by day. But the Untaines carried no mercy. Only cold wind and endless silence pressed against the estate. The Cannibal family, as whispers now called them, became phantoms in local memory. Shadows of a curse. No one dared challenge. Samuel watched from the high windows, knowing the world suspected, but would not yet move against them. He understood the lesson written in the smoke. The greatest prison was not iron chains, but the fear of truth left unspoken. The prisoners stirred restless in the night, plotting behind their shallow breaths, believing the whispers from the outside world would soon break through the valley. Marcus tested his chains with quiet persistence. David scraped at iron with splinters of bone, both clinging to the hope that deliverance waited beyond the tree line. They thought themselves clever, but Samuel saw through them. He had lived too long in bondage to miss the rhythm of rebellion. He knew the sound of chains shifting with intent and the furtive glance of men nursing forbidden plans. Samuel gathered the family and spoke with a gravity that chilled the air. He told them weakness could not be tolerated. Not now, not ever. The mountains demanded loyalty, absolute and without compromise. If one link in the chain broke, the whole would shatter. Ruth argued quietly that perhaps the men could still serve, that their knowledge had not yet been exhausted, but Samuel shook his head with a finality that silenced her. He had seen mercy turn to ruin before, and he would not watch it happen again. The night of judgment arrived as snow blanketed the valley. The family assembled by the hearth, the air heavy with smoke and expectation. Marcus and David dragged into the circle, their faces pale with the dawning realization that hope had betrayed them. They pleaded, they promised silence, they offered secrets, yet Samuel's eyes held no softness. He spoke of survival as law, a command carved into the marrow of their existence. To falter would mean death, not only for them but for the children who looked on with wide, unblinking eyes. The execution was swift and merciless. Ruth turned her face away, but her hands still moved steady, helping to prepare. What followed, Joshua kept the fire stoked. Sarah carried water. Moses stirred the pot. The children watched with a grim calm that marked the final death of innocence. Marcus and David became sustenance there. Rebellion devoured both in flesh and in spirit. Their screams echoed briefly, then vanished into the endless hush of winter. When it was done, Samuel stood tall before the family, his voice deep and unwavering. He told them that this was the way of freedom, that survival was not granted. It was seized and defended without pity. The children listened, and the lesson etched itself into their souls. They would never again believe in rescue. They would never again mistake mercy for strength. They were the mountain now, and the mountain would endure. The valley did not remain silent forever. Rumors traveled far enough to reach ears that thrived on curiosity and greed. Hunters who sold pelts in distant towns spoke of the Harwick estate as a place where shadows never lifted. A merchant claimed he saw a child moving behind shuttered windows, though no child of Harwick blood should have remained alive. Farmers whispered that cattle disappeared near the tree line, leaving only blood-stained snow as evidence. These whispers festered until they reached the ears of men who lived for coin and spectacle. A small party of traders and armed frontiersmen gathered one gray morning, determined to see with their own eyes what had become of the estate. They armed themselves with rifles and blades and made their way into the valley. Their boots broke the silence of snow-packed ground, their breath rising in pale clouds. The closer they drew, the heavier the air became, carrying with it a strange musk that made even hardened men uneasy. By the time the estate loomed into view, its windows black and unblinking, like the eyes of a corpse, the party felt the weight of something that should have been left undisturbed. Inside, Samuel had already seen them. He kept watch from the high window, his gaze steady and cold. He did not panic, nor did he call for retreat. Instead, he ordered silence. The fire dimmed. The smoke concealed the children hidden away with Ruth's steady hand. Joshua readied the traps that lined the forest edge, sharpened stakes, and carefully placed snares. The family became shadows pressed close together, listening to the crunch of boots draw nearer. The men outside circled the house, calling names into the void. Their voices cracked with false bravado, but none dared step across the threshold. They tapped on glass with rifle barrels. They pressed against the door, but it would not yield. At last one dared kick it open. But inside, he found only silence. A dark ness. That swallowed sound. The party withdrew, unsettled, whispering curses as they fled back into the storm. Their retreat carried no relief, for they knew they had not entered a ruin, but trespassed a tomb still occupied. Samuel turned from the window, his voice low but strong. He told the family that the mountain itself had spoken. Those men would carry fear back into the world, and fear was their strongest shield. They would not need to hunt their enemies. Their enemies would hunt themselves, consumed by whispers of what lived in the valley. The legend began to spread across the ridges like wildfire carried on the breath of every trader. every hunter, every preacher who passed near the valley. They spoke of a house where no light dared linger, of a family that should have been dead, yet moved within the walls with unholy persistence. Some called them ghosts. Others swore they were witches still. Others whispered the word cannibal, with a shudder that chilled taverns into silence. The Harwick name, once gilded with wealth, now became a curse. Muttered only when the wind howled, fear twisted with fascination, and fascination bred myth. Soon songs were sung in hushed tones around fire pits. Children were warned that if they strayed too far into the trees, the cannibal family would take them. Men dared each other to venture close to the cursed valley, though few returned with more than pale faces and trembling hands. Every tale fed the legend until it no longer mattered what was true and what was rumor. The family had become more than flesh and bone. They had become an idea, a terror that walked in the minds of men. Inside the estate, the family listened, Moses and Sarah wide-eyed as the whispers reached their ears. Samuel told them it was power, pure and sharp, sharper than any blade. He explained that fear was the strongest weapon one could wield, for it required no touch, no shot, no blow. It spread on its own, feeding and multiplying without end. Ruth taught the children that their survival had given them more than life. It had given them dominion over memory itself. Their enemies had fallen silent, but their voices carried louder than ever through the mouths of strangers. Yet with power came danger. Samuel knew this too. If fear grew too large, it would draw not only whisperers, but hunters organized and relentless. He prepared for the day when the valley would be tested again. Traps refined, paths concealed, signals agreed upon in silence. Joshua Boo, out hiding places beneath floorboards. Ruth stored herbs and medicines. Sarah learned the signs of patrol from a distance. Moses practiced moving through woods like a shadow. The children did not play, they trained. Night after night, Samuel's voice bound them tighter. "You are not merely survivors," he told them. "You are the proof that chains can break, and once broken, the broken can never be reforged. This house is no longer a prison. It is a throne built from bones and whispers." And as the firelight flickered across their faces, the family understood. They were not just feared, they were becoming immortal. The whispers did not remain. Whispers forever. Fear has a way of drawing men together, especially when coin and vengeance sharpen their resolve. In distant taverns, plans were laid over mugs of bitter ale. Traders who had lost profit joined voices with preachers who cried of abomination. Hunters spoke of cleansing the land. Merchants promised reward. The Harwick estate, once untouchable by rumor, now became a target of purpose. A band of armed men was raised, not ragged trappers, but organized, determined, and fueled by the righteousness of fear. The journey into the valley began beneath a steel-gray sky. Hooves cracked the frozen earth, wagons groaned beneath weight of supplies. Rifles glistened. Bayonets caught what little light the sun offered. They came not to witness. They came to destroy, to erase the stain whispered in every corner of the frontier. They came to burn the house and whatever dwelled within it. Inside, Samuel saw them long before they crossed the river. His eyes narrowed as he counted their number more than ever before. He gathered the family, his voice steady with fire. "This is the moment," he told them. "The mountain has tested us once more. We do not flee. We do not beg. We remind the world that the broken do not return to chains." Ruth prepared herbs that numbed fear. Moses and Sarah lit the hidden lanterns. Joshua secured the traps with a precision that turned forest into battlefield. Each heartbeat became a drum of defiance. When the outsiders reached the estate, they expected to find madness and rot. Instead, they found silence, cold and perfect. The house loomed unbroken, its windows black, its chimney still. The men circled rifles, raised torches lit. Yet every step they took seemed swallowed by the valley's hunger, as though the earth itself resisted their presence. Then the first trap snapped, a man screaming as stakes drove through his leg. A second fell into a pit carved deep into the froze. End-ground panic rippled, but discipline held. They pressed forward, determined to tear down the house. From within, Samuel waited, not with fear, but with certainty. He whispered to the children to remember what they had become. Not victims, not prisoners, but the heirs of the mountain's cruel law. The storm outside was no longer weather. It was war. And in that moment, every flicker of fire, every breath of smoke, every shadow on the wall became a weapon sharpened by hunger and bound by blood. The first shot split the air like thunder, tearing through the stillness of the valley. The outsiders advanced with rifles, leveled torches flaring against the snow. Their shouts echoed with the rage of men, convinced they fought demons rather than flesh. The family remained silent shadows within the house, watching, waiting. Samuel's hand raised a signal, and the mountain itself seemed to awaken. Arrows loosed from hidden ridges tore into the men. Joshua's traps sprang with brutal precision. Iron jaws snapping wood, splintering blood, painting the white earth. The valley became a labyrinth of death. Each scream carried high and cold as the outsiders stumbled into snares and pits. Some fired blindly into the dark, their shots striking nothing but trees, while others fell to ground slick with their own lifeblood. Fear began to gnaw at their courage faster than any weapon could. Inside, Ruth worked with steady resolve, crushing herbs, mixing drafts that sharpened focus and dulled terror. Sarah and Moses carried messages between rooms, their small forms unseen in the chaos. Samuel moved like a commander forged by chains and hardened by hunger. He did not shout. He did not panic. His voice remained low, calm, absolute. Every order carried the weight of survival. Every glance bound his people tighter to the will of the mountain. The outsiders pushed closer, breaking through the first line of defenses. Flames licked the porch rifles. Cracked glass splintered. Yet for every step gained, they paid in blood. The family struck with precision, slipping through hidden doors, firing from shadows, then vanishing like smoke. The house itself seemed alive, its halls echoing with the cries of those who dared invade. Every room became a grave, every stair a snare, every breath a trap. And as the battle raged, Samuel's words thundered within his people. "We are not prey. We are not slaves. We are the storm you tried to chain in storms. Do not bow." The children listened, their eyes burning with a knowledge no child should carry. The outsiders had brought war, but they had underestimated the hunger of the mountain. Hunger that would not stop until every intruder was swallowed whole. The torches guttered in the snowstorm, their flames bending low as if the mountain itself wished to snuff them out. Men cursed as their powder dampened their boots, sank deep in drifts, their bodies heavy with the weight of fear. The outsiders had come believing they were hunters, but now they staggered like cattle marked for slaughter. The forest around them whispered with voices not carried by wind, voices that made their skin crawl with the certainty that they were trespassers in a place older and darker than law. Samuel stepped into the open, his face lit only by the reflection of firelight on blood snow and steel. He raised no rifle, carried no torch. His presence alone stilled the world around him. For a moment, the outsiders saw not a man, but a figure shaped by vengeance, a force sculpted by generations of silence and torment. They raised their weapons, but their hands trembled as though some unseen weight pressed them downward. From the shadows emerged Ruth and Sarah, knives, glinting eyes burning. Their movements were not frantic, but measured like ritual. William had once taught Eleanor the butcher's dance of carving meat clean and true. Now the enslaved performed that dance with the knowledge of necessity and justice. Each cut, each strike bore the memory of starvation nights, when they had been left with scraps unfit even for dogs. Each blade sang with the memory of lash and chain, until the snow itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of retribution. The outsiders broke rank. One man fled into the trees, his screams echoing moments later as hidden traps swallowed him whole. Another dropped his rifle, begging for mercy. But mercy had long since rotted in this valley, replaced with something colder, sharper, inexorable. Samuel's voice carried over the screams, not as a shout but as a sermon. "We did not choose this hunger. You chose it for us when you denied us bread. You chose it for us when you, too, turned our labor into chains. You chose it for us when you made us less than human. Now the mountain has chosen you. The outsiders fired one last desperate volley, but their shots found nothing but the dark. Their ranks crumbled into chaos, while the family pressed closer, blades flashing teeth, bared breath rising in plumes of steam. The hunters had become prey, and the valley closed its jaws tighter with every heartbeat. The snow grew red beneath their feet, soaking into drifts until the ground looked like torn velvet. The outsiders' bodies twitched in the cold, their cries fading into the silence of winter. The mountain wind carried away their last words, leaving only the sound of flesh striking flesh, steel cutting through bone, and the steady rhythm of survival painted as vengeance. Samuel did not allow chaos. His hand directed every motion like a conductor guiding an orchestra. Ruth carved clean and quick her knife. Following Eleanor's recipes with cruel precision, Sarah dragged the fallen to the smokehouse, stacking them in the order Samuel dictated, while young Moses kept the fires burning hot enough to keep death from freezing too soon. This was no frenzy, no madness. It was order discipline ritual, each act an inversion of years when they had been forced to obey. Now obedience served their freedom, not their chains. From within the smokehouse, a smell rose thick and undeniable. It was the scent that had carried through the valley for months, drawing suspicion and whispers. Meat cured just as Eleanor had taught them, though now, the source came from those who had sought to crush them. The outsiders had wanted blood. They had given it, but in a form the hunters had never imagined. Their flesh was not wasted, their bodies not abandoned to rot, but preserved, prepared, transformed into sustenance. As Ruth wiped her knife across her apron, she whispered words only Sarah heard. "We will not starve this winter." Her daughter nodded silently, her young face lit by firelight, not with innocence but with a hard understanding that survival demanded sacrifice. Justice in this place did not come from courts or preachers. It came from smoke-fire steel and the will to live. Samuel raised his eyes to the rafters of the smokehouse, where strips of meat already hung glistening in the rising haze. His voice, low but steady, carried to every ear in that frozen hollow. "Tonight we feed the valley, and the valley will remember. This is no longer their land. It is ours now, and it will be ours until the last snows melt and the last hunger is satisfied." The flames crackled higher as if sealing his vow. The outsiders were gone, their names already swallowed by the smoke. Their bones would season the mountain, their blood would darken the soil. Their memory would live not in monuments or graves, but in the strength of those who had once been enslaved. Now the valley itself bore witness to a new truth, carved in fire and flesh. Spring crept into the mountains late that year, the thaw reluctant as though the land itself feared revealing what winter had buried. Streams swelled with meltwater rushing through the hollows, carrying with them the silence of months past. When the snow finally loosened its grip, it uncovered not bones or graves, but a property that seemed alive, thriving more than it ever had under the Harwick name. The smokehouse still breathed steady plumes into the sky, its chimney dark against the pale bloom of early flowers. Travelers moving through the passes, after long isolation, paused to marvel at the sight. They saw fences, repaired fields turned for planting, and structures maintained with a care that spoke of diligence and pride. No one asked too deeply why the Harwick family themselves were nowhere to be seen. The mountain taught its people not to ask questions when answers carried danger. A federal revenue agent named Joseph McKinley was the first to step onto the property, official papers tucked into his coat. He had come chasing rumors of moonshine that defied tax law, expecting disorder and ruin. What he found was order so precise it startled him. Barrels stacked neatly, smokehouse fires at perfect burn, and meat stocks, preserved in quantities too great to be mere happenstance. The workers he saw were not slaves, nor were they idle. They moved with confidence and knowledge, as if every stone and beam belonged to them. Samuel greeted him with calm authority, his voice smooth, his gaze unshaken. He told McKinley the Harwicks had left for Richmond for the season, leaving him entrusted with the operations. The story fit the scene so well that the agent accepted it without resistance. The report he filed later spoke of a prosperous property operating at peak efficiency, a model of mountain enterprise. No suspicion stained his words, only admiration for management skill. Yet beneath the polished surface an other truth simmered. The smokehouse carried memories in its rafters that no spring breeze could wash away. The salted meat that filled the larder bore flavors that could never be confessed. Ruth's notebooks grew heavier with recipes marked with both practicality and something darker. Her handwriting captured not only the ratios of salt and smoke, but the taste of justice seasoned by hunger. To outsiders, the Harwick estate seemed reborn stronger than before. To those who knew better, it was something far more unsettling. It was proof that power once stolen could be taken back, reshaped and fed into a future that no law could contain. The mountain had been given its payment in full, and the valley whispered that it had finally eaten well. By summer, the Harwick property no longer looked like a place scarred by blood or haunted by whispers. It looked like prosperity. Reborn. Customers who had once dealt with the family returned and found the same barrels of moonshine, the same cured meats, the same promises of quality. Yet something in the air felt heavier, as though unseen eyes lingered in the rafters above every trade. Neighbors began to notice the silence of absence. The Harwicks had not been seen in town, not at church, not along the trade routes that carried their influence. Still, mountain people survived by burying their questions in the soil. They spoke politely to Samuel and the others. They admired Ruth's cooking. They traded fairly with Joshua and Thomas. They smiled at the children who now carried themselves like heirs instead of servants. And yet behind closed doors certain suspicions grew. Whispers drifted down hollows carried on smoke that smelled too rich during a winter, where game had been scarce, too constant when hunting had clearly failed. Some claimed the meat tasted different, darker in flavor, seasoned, not only with spices, but with something primal that touched a place in the mind where fear lives. Ruth's notebooks, hidden away, detailed each recipe with clinical precision. Meat yields noted by weight preservation ratios documented as though she knew one day the record itself would be the only evidence of truth. The others pretended not to notice how she sometimes stared into the fire, as if she saw more than flame. The children, too, had changed. They no longer looked like victims, but like inheritors of knowledge. They watched adults with a sharpness beyond their years. They whispered at night about smokehouse secrets and played games that echoed rituals they had witnessed. The mountain raised children fast, but here it had raised something else entirely. Resilience sharpened into quiet power. Neighbors came and not making their trade, smiling at Samuel's calm authority. But they remembered the timing. They remembered how smoke had never ceased from the chimneys, even in the darkest weeks of snow. They remembered how the taste of meat during that famine carried them through, but left an unease that no blessing at table could cleanse. Over time, the story twisted into legend, a tale told to frighten children or to remind masters that cruelty carries a price. The Cannibal family of Appalachia became a whisper, and then a warning passed in the shadows of the valley. Years turned into decades, and the story of the Harwick property refused to die. The mountain itself seemed to remember. Every winter when smoke curled unnaturally from the ruins of the old smokehouse, travelers swore they smelled cooking meat drifting through the trees. Though no one lived there anymore, the legend took root stronger than the truth. It grew into a warning told by firelight and whispered in fields, a tale that bound the valley in silence. Martha Delacroix, the last living witness, carried the memory longer than anyone. Born on a neighboring farm, she had watched the Harwick family vanish and Samuel's group rise in their place. On her deathbed at 94, she confessed to her grandson that she had known the truth all along. She had traded with Samuel, seen Ruth cook, tasted the meat, and felt the strange silence of a home where masters had disappeared, but work had never ceased. She revealed a wooden box hidden under her mattress, containing scraps of proof. A button from Samuel's coat, a ribbon from young Sarah's hair, and most damning, a letter written in Samuel's hand. The letter, dated October 1848, spoke words heavier than any confession. We leave this place to those who can use it better than we did. Survival is not living. Freedom is not absence of chains, but the power to choose your own moral boundaries. We learned that some choices once made cannot be unmade. The valley will always be hungry, but we will not be the ones to feed it. After that, Samuel, Ruth, and the children vanished. Some say they followed the Underground Railroad to the north. Ruth opening a restaurant, Samuel becoming a teacher, the children living lives that belonged to them at last, but the property itself was never free. Neighbors continued to report strange sights. Phantom smoke drifting across the ridges, whispers in the hollows that carried on winter wind. The mountain remembered, and it would not let men forage. T. The Cannibal family of Appalachia was never just a story of revenge. It was a reckoning. A revelation that when cruelty is absolute, survival demands absolute return. Their choice turned history upside down. It created a legend too heavy for time to bury. And even now, when the wind carries the scent of wood smoke through the Blue Ridge hollows, some swear it carries something more. A reminder that hunger is eternal, and justice once fed will always return for another meal.